A teenager abandons his life on his family's farm and heads to the city in search of work, only to get fired within just 6 days. He dropped out of school and was now alone with seemingly no prospects. However, fast forward a few decades, and Henry Ford had built an empire and completely revolutionized not just the car industry, but business as we know it. He pioneered assembly line production, the 5-day work week, and countless more innovations. But this is certainly not a straightforward success story. Henry Ford's life is wrapped in controversy, failures, and obsessive genius. We'll not only look at Henry Ford's astonishing rise, but also his lesser-known projects, like the time he tried to build his own weird American town called Fordlandia in the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. We'll also look at the very dark truth about Henry Ford, and why one of his biggest fans was Adolf Hitler. This is a story of innovation and success, a brutal struggle for wealth and power. This is the shocking true story of Henry Ford. Born on July 30th, 1863, Henry Ford was raised on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, which he quickly grew to dislike. Henry often avoided his daily responsibilities as the eldest son, spending most of the day at home, while his 5 younger siblings worked out in the field. One neighbor even described Henry as the laziest boy on the face of the earth. But there was a reason why Henry spent much of the day indoors. He had a complete fascination with machinery. Going as far as to sharpen a pair of his mother's knitting needles into screwdrivers, Henry spent as much time as he could conducting experiments around the house, like tinkering with the clocks and farming equipment, trying to understand how they worked. But soon Henry started attending school and found it even more tedious than the farm. He thought it was a waste of time and never made it past the 8th grade. Instead, Henry preferred to learn on his own, and as he got older, he enlisted his siblings and friends to help build a variety of machines, from water wheels to miniature steam engines. Even though his projects often ended in a small explosion or even the occasional injury, it was clear Henry had a talent when it came to machinery. Perhaps the greatest leap in his development came when his father gifted him a pocket watch at age 13. Henry quickly taught himself how to take it apart and put it back together again. He practiced doing this over and over, getting faster each time, and before long, he was getting paid to repair watches for people all around town. But just a few months later, Henry experienced a life-changing moment. Traveling to Detroit with his father, Henry saw his first horseless vehicle. It was a tractor powered by a steam engine, and Henry was so captivated by the machine that he silently promised himself that he would make a vehicle like that of his own. Unfortunately, that was also the year that tragedy struck. When he was only 13, Henry's mother passed away due to childbirth complications. Henry was closer with her than anyone else in the world, and her death left him heartbroken. He described life on the farm without her as a watch without a mainspring. Henry then began to hate his rural life more than ever. He felt he was destined for greater things than milking cows and harvesting crops, but as the eldest son, his father expected him to eventually take ownership of their farm. This tension grew until Henry finally decided to leave home at the age of 16, abandoning the family business, and head to Detroit. This was a huge disappointment to his father and put a big strain on their relationship. And things got even worse when just a week into his new job in Detroit, Henry got fired. Henry suddenly found himself alone in a new city without an income. But surprisingly, help would come from the last place he expected. Henry was rescued by his father, who landed him a repairman job at a machine shop run by a longtime friend of his. Though his father was disappointed with Henry for turning his back on the family business, he recognized Henry's remarkable mechanical ability and knew this work would be good for him. So Henry found cheap housing with his aunt and took on additional night work as a jewelry repairman. Between the two jobs, he made $5.50 a week. And more importantly, Henry's role as a repairman allowed him to experiment with a wide variety of machines. This time was essential in his development as a mechanic, essentially serving as the education he never had. But after 9 months on the job, Henry decided he'd learned all he could and moved back home. And it was there, in 1882, that a neighbour came seeking Henry's help to operate a newly purchased steam engine. Henry agreed immediately, despite the fact he'd never operated a steam engine in his life. He walked up to the shaking machine that was much larger than he was, calmly referring to it as the little engine. Henry fed the fire and adjusted the valves until suddenly the machine was up and running. The neighbour was so happy he offered Henry full-time work with a daily salary of $3. But word soon spread of this young man setting up and operating a steam engine despite no formal training, and at the end of the summer, a representative from Westinghouse, a company that manufactured these steam engines, came and offered Henry a job as a steam engine repairman. Henry accepted and spent the next several summers repairing engines across Michigan and Ohio. But Henry didn't forget his dream. During the winters, he attempted to make his own steam-powered vehicle, just like the one he'd been so mesmerized by when he was younger. But despite countless hours of work, this was one thing Henry just couldn't seem to do. Even though the first steam-powered vehicle was made in 1769, that engine and later versions operated on a track, and Henry was intent to make a vehicle which could drive on the road. But he realized that steam engines weighed far too much to be effective for quick, trackless vehicles. Thus, Henry was left with his dream, but seemingly no way to make it a reality. Flicking through a magazine, Henry Ford first came across an invention described as a silent gas engine. Henry actually dismissed the invention at first, considering it too weak to be a viable source of power. But a couple of years later, a company asked him to repair such an engine. This experience completely changed Henry's perception of gasoline combustion, as it produced far more energy than he'd anticipated, and the engine was much more lightweight. Henry knew he had finally found a machine to power his horseless vehicle. He suggested to his fiancée Clara that they move back to Detroit so that he could learn more about the gasoline engine. She agreed, which was lucky, because Henry had actually accepted a job in the city a week earlier as a repairman with the Edison Illuminating Company. Thomas Edison was one of Henry Ford's heroes, and he felt this was the ideal place to work and learn. This role also gave him first-hand experience working with gasoline engines. And Henry quickly impressed at the company, and soon worked his way up to becoming chief engineer, where his pay doubled to $80 a week. But best of all, since the position only required work on call, Henry had more time and freedom to work on his own creations, and in particular his horseless carriage concept, which he now knew was possible with a gasoline engine. In fact, at a company retreat, he finally got to meet Thomas Edison himself, who encouraged Henry to keep pursuing the idea, and the two would later become close friends. To add to Henry's good fortune, in 1888 he married Clara, and in 1893 they welcomed the birth of Edsel, Henry Ford's only child. And it was that same year that Henry burst into the room on Christmas Eve to tell his wife he'd finally made his first gasoline engine. Admittedly, at this point it was still very basic and only ran for a minute, but all those years of tinkering had paid off. And now that he knew how to create the engine, he could focus on his dream of building his first horseless carriage. For the next 3 years, Henry worked tirelessly on the machine, using parts that would have been thrown out by the factory, like leftover tubing. And by 1896, it was finally ready. Made up of 2 bicycles welded to a square chassis, it was dubbed the quadricycle. The vehicle took its first drive early in the morning of June 4th, 1896. And amazingly, the car drove quickly and reliably. Though other inventors had already created working gas-powered automobiles, Henry's quadricycle was one of the fastest of its time, with a top speed of 20 miles per hour. However, Henry knew this was just the start, and so he sold his quadricycle for $200 and used the money to begin working on the second model of his vehicle. This would take him 3 more years to complete. But when he was done, he had a much improved version of his car. It was larger, faster, and ran more smoothly. At this point though, Henry was desperate to invent full-time, but just didn't have enough money to do so. He realized that he would need investors to pursue his passion, and so he set out to raise some money, ready to take the biggest risk of his career and start his own company. In 1899, Henry had the chance to drive a wealthy lumber salesman on a 3.5-mile drive. By the end of the ride, the salesman was so enthralled by Henry's car that he immediately agreed to invest in Henry's new company. By showing off his car like this, Henry managed to acquire a total of 12 investors and a capital of $15,000. And thus, the Detroit Automotive Company was founded in August 1899, with Henry placed as the chief engineer. By this point though, there were many other brands of horseless carriages. All of them were handmade and extremely expensive, and because of this, cars only served to function as luxury items for the rich. Whereas Henry's goal was to craft efficient, well-made vehicles that were affordable for the masses. Unfortunately, this was not what his shareholders wanted. The investors demanded a variety of different vehicles built as quickly as possible to sell for a premium price to wealthy hobbyists, regardless of build quality or reliability. Henry was in constant conflict with shareholders as they grew furious with the constant production delays. They pressed for higher profits, whilst Henry pressed for perfection. Although Henry had mastered how to build an automobile, he had definitely not mastered the business side of things. His experience was in crafting vehicles one at a time, putting a lot of care into each one, but shareholders pushed him to churn out cars at a quality he wasn't happy with and at prices he didn't feel were justified. And it turns out the public agreed with him. The vehicles were simply too much for poor quality. As a result, the company wasn't profitable and continued to have issues and delays. So within only 2 years of its grand opening, the Detroit Automobile Company was dissolved in 1901. Despite the failure of the Detroit Automobile Company, Henry still had well-connected friends in the city, some of which owned a warehouse where they allowed Henry to continue to work on his inventions. Although his first business hadn't worked out, Henry at least now had more freedom to focus on what he actually wanted. And at this point, he wanted to make his own race car, as that would allow him to work on a singular car for a long period of time. And it turns out, Henry had an idea. Henry felt that other racers of the time were far too focused on power, when actually he felt a car would be much more successful by making it lighter. And thus, Henry began work on a very lightweight 26 horsepower 2-cylinder racer. This philosophy won Henry his first race in a 10-lap competition at the Detroit Driving Club. Following the fame Henry gained from winning several more races with his lightweight racer, many of the same shareholders from the failed Detroit Automobile Company got back in touch with Henry. They basically agreed that given Henry's recent success in the racing world, maybe they should try again to set up a company producing cars together, and thus the Henry Ford Company was founded. The goal of this company was to produce lightweight city cars. However, Henry's recent victory in racing had made him obsessed. All he wanted to do was build race cars and to figure out how to make them go as fast as possible. So just like with their first company, Henry was constantly at odds with shareholders. Because instead of focusing on producing passenger cars and focusing on profits, Henry fixated on the mechanical ability of individual race cars, once more chasing perfection. Investors were again extremely frustrated and eventually replaced Henry Ford as chief engineer. Thus, Henry Ford left the Henry Ford Company, signing a contract that gave him the rights of his name back, $900, and the designs for the 4-cylinder racer he'd been working on. With Henry's sudden departure, they obviously needed a new name, so they reorganized the business as the Cadillac Automobile Company, which went on to find great commercial success. Meanwhile, Henry Ford was once again now out on his own, and with 2 business failures under his belt already. But of course, Henry wasn't going to give up that easily. He returned to racing and in 1901 created the groundbreaking Ford 999, a car that swept the competition. 2 years later, the next iteration of this car broke all American driving records with a top speed of 56 miles per hour. All of this success in the racing world catapulted Henry Ford's reputation to new heights, which once again attracted the attention of a lot of investors who wanted to work with him. Surely there was some way to turn Henry's inventions and innovative mind into a very profitable company. And this is what led to Henry starting his third and final business venture in 1903, the Ford Motor Company. Whilst cars still remained a luxury item for the rich, Henry had always wanted to change that. He declared, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude." His new company's first product was a 2-cylinder, 8-horsepower passenger car known as the Model A. Their first car sold for $750 a week before Henry's 40th birthday. Whilst it was a reasonable start, these first cars were made at a factory in Mack Avenue, Detroit, with several workers building 2 or 3 cars each day entirely by hand, and so it was still a very slow process. However, everything changed when Henry Ford visited a slaughterhouse in Chicago. It was here that Henry had an idea that would change everything. Henry observed as the cow carcasses moved along an automatic conveyor belt while each worker performed one specific task to prepare it for consumption. Like cogs in a machine, the workers were unbelievably quick and efficient. Henry decided to adopt the innovation of the assembly line for his own car factories, splitting the production process into a series of small individual tasks. He'd then assign workers to one task each, which they could complete quickly over and over again, with no skill or experience required. Immediately, factory efficiency increased by 500%, and Henry was able to quickly expand and hire 300 new employees, since he could hire cheap, low-skilled labor to do these repetitive tasks. Henry then took his radical practices one step further. Knowing from personal experience how a single missing part could delay car production for weeks, he began to implement the manufacturing of individual car parts in his factories, making everything from engines to transmissions. This sped up production time even more, and whereas it had initially taken Henry 2.5 days to build a single car, it now only took 90 minutes. This extreme progress set the stage for him to launch the Model T, which would go on to be one of the most successful cars in history. Thanks to all the improvements Henry had made to the production process, he was finally able to produce a car for the average person. There were 3 ideas he wanted for this car: for it to be affordable, durable, and easy to operate, and that's exactly what he did. Every Model T rolled out of the factory with the same interchangeable parts and the same shade of black paint, coming with a detailed instruction manual so the owners could understand and fix the vehicles themselves. It was an immediate bestseller, bringing in huge profits for the company and allowing them to ramp up production even further. By 1914, Henry was selling more cars than all other car manufacturers in America combined. Before long, every other car on the road was a Ford. And surprisingly, as Model Ts flew out of the dealerships, Henry steadily decreased the price of the car. Whilst this went against what most companies would do, Henry knew if he lowered the price further, he could get even more people to buy his car and ensure it remained the most popular choice. And sure enough, before the end of its production, over 15 million Model Ts would be sold. However, Henry Ford had a huge problem. Many of his workers had become extremely disappointed in their new jobs, having gone from assembling entire cars by hand to completing the same monotonous task day in and day out. All the skill and craftsmanship seemed to have been taken away with this assembly line style production. Many workers quit, and the Ford Motor Company faced an extremely high turnover rate of 380%, a problem which could easily lead to the end of the company. Before we get to the next chapter, it's time to answer one of the questions I get most. How do we make these videos on Magnates Media? And how can you create high quality videos yourself on a budget? Well, for years now, I've been using Storyblocks, and it's genuinely one of the best purchases I've made. So I reached out to Storyblocks to see if they'd sponsor this video so I can tell you all about them, and luckily, they agreed. Now, the reason I like Storyblocks so much is that it gives you an insanely large library of professional content and assets that you can easily integrate into your videos. This includes videos, images, editing templates, music, and sound effects. You just search what you're looking for and get countless options to download. But whereas a lot of stock footage you have to pay per clip, with Storyblocks, you get unlimited access to their entire library with millions of assets with just one low-cost subscription. Plus, anything you download through Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free, so no copyright or monetization issues. No matter whether you're just starting out making content or you're already an experienced creator, Storyblocks can help you find the perfect clips and audio for your content. To get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/magnates or click the link in the description. Henry Ford did something extreme. He doubled the pay of his workers from $2.50 to $5 a day, which back then was considered a very good wage, much higher than what other companies paid. Not just that, since a large number of the workers were immigrants, Henry provided free English lessons so they could communicate better on the factory floor. He also reduced their working hours from 9 to 8 hours and introduced the 5-day work week, giving his employees the weekend off, whereas up until this point, most workers only got Sundays off. These changes went completely against the norms of the time, and Henry faced a familiar problem. His shareholders were outraged. They felt as if money was being stolen out of their pockets and given to workers for no reason. Henry tried to explain his theory that allowing workers to have more rest would inspire them to work harder when they were on the job. He also explained the higher wage would attract more workers. And sure enough, workers across the country soon flocked to the Ford factories of Detroit, causing an economic boom for the city and forcing competitors to enact similar policies because they were losing their employees to Ford. Plus, Henry's decision to decrease work time by 1 hour allowed Henry to add a third 8-hour shift to the schedule. With 3 8-hour shifts, the factory could run 24 hours a day, staying open at all times. And thus, whilst Henry's changes seemed surprising at the time, they all made a lot of sense. And it's partially thanks to Henry Ford that most modern businesses today use the model of the 8-hour workday and 5-day workweek. However, at the time, the shareholders didn't see these changes as progress. They ordered Henry to stop increasing wages, and when he refused, they took him to court and claimed he was intentionally costing them money and breaching his duties to shareholders. Henry felt like his business was being taken away from him. He'd worked so hard to build it up from nothing, and whilst he was finally seeing success, once again his clashes with shareholders were putting it all at risk. He couldn't start over again. Henry knew he needed to seize control of the company as quickly as possible. So in 1906, using his own personal savings, Henry bought enough of the company's stock to bring his ownership interest up to 51%, making him the majority owner and controlling shareholder. He'd put basically all of his money into the company, but he was betting on himself. In 1919, Henry handed over leadership to his son Edsel, naming him president of the Ford Motor Company. However, Henry still ruled behind the scenes with an iron fist, and was the one still making the big decisions. For example, Edsel urged his father to modernize the company, and he would come into the office each day with new plans and proposals. But Henry was extremely harsh on his son, and often responded with a barrage of shouts and insults, refusing to produce any new cars Edsel suggested, because Henry claimed that the Model T was all that customers wanted. Not only did Henry refuse his son's ideas, he ordered members of upper management to send Edsel on week-long meetings across the country to keep him out the office. But it turns out, Edsel may have been onto something, because year after year, sales of the Model T decreased. A half-decade of prosperity in America and cheap credit resulted in public demand for stylized, more luxurious cars, which competitors like General Motors and Chrysler were happy to provide. And so finally in 1927, Henry could no longer disagree with the diminishing number of sales and consented to building a new vehicle. Ford created a new version of the Model A, catered to the modern demands of the industry. It boasted the first commercial V8 engine and was offered in 4 different colors. However, by the time the Ford Motor Company could start selling their new Model A, they'd already fallen to 3rd place amongst the car manufacturers in the United States, behind Chrysler and General Motors. And soon after, the Great Depression hit, forcing Ford to lay off many workers and lower the high wages that the company had been known for. Whilst he still claimed to be a man of the people, Henry ended up hiring a secret police force to spy on his employees when he heard some of them were attempting to unionize. Henry even employed people in his factory to root out union organizers and have them beaten. When workers protested, Henry ordered police to quell them and attack the protesting workers with tear gas and even gunfire. Tragically, this resulted in the death of 4 workers in what was known as the Ford Massacre, and things would soon get even more controversial. In the late 1920s, Henry bought up millions of acres of land in Brazil in one of the wildest places on Earth. You see, the synthetic rubber market didn't really exist back then, but rubber was needed in large quantities for the vast amount of cars Ford was now mass producing. And so in an attempt to build a reliable source of rubber, Henry set up a rubber plantation in the Brazilian jungle so they could farm rubber trees. The plan was to harvest the rubber and ship it back to Detroit, where it would be turned into tires and other parts for Ford cars. But rubber wasn't the only goal. Henry Ford also wanted to create a utopia modeled after the rural America he grew up in. Essentially, he wanted to build a self-sufficient town in the heart of the jungle where all the workers on his rubber plantation would live. He called it Fordlandia, and it had homes, shops, a school, a hospital, a golf course, and of course a processing plant for all that rubber. In total, it housed over 7,000 individuals.
Ford's rubber development on the Tapajós River is an enterprise of historic proportion. Here, 2 million acres of jungle are being converted into a highly modernized plantation, capable of producing rubber on a large scale. Deep in the wilderness, this model community is self-sufficient in every detail.
However, Henry wanted the town to operate under a very strict and controversial set of rules, which were enforced by the American managers. Alcohol, tobacco, and playing sports were all banned within the community, even in the residents' own homes, and there was a police force to ensure all the rules were enforced. Plus, Fordlandia soon began to face a lot of challenges: adverse weather, disease outbreaks, anger amongst the workers, and environmental calamities. All of this signaled that the venture was heading towards failure, and yet despite this, Henry continued to invest millions into the project, until finally a disease crippled the town's workforce and its rubber production. Discontent amongst workers eventually led to an open revolt, and Henry had to accept Fordlandia was a very expensive mistake. Henry had to sell the plantation to the Brazilian government for only $250,000, a fraction of his total investment. And the deserted ruins of Fordlandia still remain as a symbol of Henry Ford's wild jungle utopia idea. As Henry Ford grew older, he became more and more obsessed with Jewish people, blaming them for almost everything he didn't like. A close friend quoted Henry saying, "The Jew caused the war, the Jew caused the outbreak of thievery and robbery in the country, the Jew even caused insufficiencies in the Navy." Henry would go on to fund a newspaper that published anti-Semitic articles to spread his hatred to the masses. He even published a weekly segment entitled "The International Jew, the World's Problem." Due to aggressive sales strategies, the paper got 700,000 weekly readers at its peak. And Henry would publish over 60 articles attacking Jews, later compiling them into 4 books, one of which the Nazis would cite as an inspiration to the Nazi Party. Even Adolf Hitler himself said that Henry Ford was a great personal inspiration to him, and he claimed to have a life-size portrait of Henry Ford in his office. Hitler also distributed Henry Ford's books and articles throughout Germany and mentioned Henry Ford by name in Mein Kampf. Then, in 1938, the Nazi Party awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal that could be given to foreigners, and Henry Ford gladly accepted. He was given the medal for his ideals and devotion to the same cause as the Nazi Party. And Henry Ford's relationship with Nazism went even deeper. A US Army report in 1945 stated that the German branch of the Ford Motor Company, still under Henry Ford's control, served as an arsenal for Nazism during the war. While most American companies pulled their stores from Germany at the start of World War II, Ford continued using German plants. Reports from American GIs commented how strange it was to see the Germans, America's enemies, driving Ford automobiles into battle. It's even reported that Ford utilized slave labor from concentration camps to produce cars and trucks for the Nazis. What's clear is that Henry Ford was not just anti-Semitic, he was incredibly influential in spreading anti-Semitism all around the world. In 1943, Henry's son Edsel died from stomach cancer, having never truly seen his vision realized within the Ford Motor Company, given Henry was the one still calling all the shots. In fact, Henry Ford's grandson has claimed that Henry Ford berated Edsel to death, as he felt Henry had caused him so much unnecessary stress and hardship that it had made him ill. Within a few years of his son dying, Henry Ford himself died in 1947, at 83 years of age. The Ford Motor Company was left reeling from the loss of their leader without a clear path forward. Ultimately, it was Henry Ford's grandson who took control of the company until 1979. But whereas Henry Ford single-handedly led the company for 39 years, the Ford Motor Company would change CEO 13 times over the course of the next 41 years. Regardless of the changing leadership though, the automotive giant continued to find commercial success, building on the foundations Henry had laid, producing best-selling cars like the Thunderbird, Mustang, and countless more classics. However, it would never dominate the industry as it once had under its original leader. Of course, Henry Ford would remain a divisive part of Ford's history. On the one hand, he was a genius, an innovator. He pioneered assembly line production and in many ways improved conditions for workers. But on the other hand, he was brutal towards unions, was racist, anti-Semitic, and actively spread his hatred and caused a lot of damage. In response to this, in 2001, the Ford Motor Company agreed to a $5 billion settlement, providing reparations for using Jewish slave labor in concentration camps to build factory materials. In more recent times, the Ford Motor Company has turned its focus to fuel-efficient vehicles and electric hybrids. In July 2023, the US Department of Energy announced that it would be giving Ford a $9.2 billion loan to build completely electric vehicles, the largest loan in the history of the auto industry. Valued at over $50 billion today, and ranking as one of the 10 largest car companies in the world, it's easy to forget that the Ford Motor Company started with a single farm boy and his desire to create a new kind of machine. Whilst Henry Ford remains a controversial and complex figure, there's no doubt that he changed the world and the way we do business. Which is pretty similar to Andrew Carnegie, whose story is even crazier, and you can click the thumbnail on screen now to find out why. I'll see you there. Cheers.